Shabbat Shalom. This Shabbat we read from Parshat Midbar, which is the beginning of the book of Numbers. And really, Bamidbar means in the desert or in the wilderness, but the opening passages are really all about census numbers, which is what we English speakers call the book, Numbers. Now, I don't like numbers. I'm not particularly good at numbers. I don't really like math. I don't like counting. In fact, Rabbi Hodson and counting have never really gotten along well. I remember in kindergarten, we were each given a clump of grapes, and we were supposed to tear off each individual grape and count them. And then we were supposed to give the teacher the final count of our grapes in front of the whole class. So Bobby had 9 grapes. Susie had 7 grapes. When it came to Jonathan, I had no grapes because I had eaten all of the grapes. And the first grade teacher was not impressed when I announced to the class that I had 0 grapes. But 0 is a number, I declared. 0 was my grade for that day in kindergarten. Later, when I worked at the pet store, we had to count all of our live inventory every 6 months. That's right, twice a year. We had to count every living animal in the whole entire store. That meant every hamster, every guinea pig, every bird, every fish, every cricket we had to count. I don't know if you've ever tried to count dozens of fish that all look the same, that are all swimming all over an aquarium. It's not easy. And furthermore, crickets? Who counts hundreds of bugs? We had 2 bins of crickets. The large ones were 12 cents. The small ones were 10 cents. People would buy them to feed to their pet lizards or snakes or whatever. Well, one day I was in the middle of trying to count the cricket bin, and this big guy in a cowboy hat and boots wandered over to my department, and he didn't want to buy crickets. He just wanted to talk to me about crickets while I was busy counting them. And he said, "Why are these crickets 12 cents and these crickets 10 cents? Now, I should not have said this, but I was young and I was a smart aleck, and I said, "Oh, these ones play the piano." He didn't like that. My manager didn't like that either. Another time that I had to count was when I was a USY advisor at Agudas Achim in Austin. And we had our annual Swoozy Shabbaton, and this time someone thought it would be a good idea to rent one of the antiquated dormitories at UT to host everyone. So I was in charge of 23 USYers, 12 girls and 11 boys. Now, I had somehow convinced a parent of one of the girls to chaperone the girls. And the girls, by the way, were great. They were sweet, they were kind, they never caused any trouble. But the boys were a bunch of knuckleheads, especially one of them. Now, somebody was smart enough to house all the girls on one floor of the dormitory and all the boys on the floor above them. We were several stories up. Well, on Saturday night, it was time for lights out. So I went into each room and I did a count of my knuckleheads. 1, 2, 3, 4. But I came up one short. And the kid who was missing was usually the one who caused all the trouble. So I went and asked all of his knucklehead friends, but nobody wanted to rat him out, except one kid who pulled me aside and said, "He's on the balcony." Said, "The balcony?" Yes. So he was trying to swing off the balcony of his floor, like Spider-Man, and swing to the balcony of the girls' floor beneath him. Sure enough, I go to his room, and I see him through the screen door, and there he was attempting to climb over the railing of the balcony. Keep in mind, we're several stories up. If he missteps, he'll plunge to his death. So I finally grab him and I pull him back to safety, and I lost my mind. I was freaking out. I screamed, "What are you doing?" And he looked at me and said, "I was going to study Torah." There you go. There you go. Now, after looking at some of the commentaries from the sages about our Parsha B'Midbar, I feel better about my counting skills because the rabbis also feel uncomfortable about counting as well. They question how it was possible to count every person in antiquity. And then they mention that King David, even his son King Solomon, the wisest man on earth, they say that they even had trouble and a difficult time taking a census. They note the various discrepancies in the numbers and counts throughout the Torah. And then they also note that in the rest of the Tanakh as well, the numbers seem to be fuzzy. And finally, they conclude that only God can truly know the real numbers. They say, after all, it is God who counts every sin. I feel like numbers are too impersonal. Since the tragedy of October 7th, I feel like we've been continuously subjected to awful numbers. Numbers of Israelis murdered, numbers of Israelis captured, numbers of Israelis missing, numbers of hostages, numbers of those hostages who died while in captivity, numbers of bodies Hamas is holding and refusing to return. Every awful headline includes a new horrible set of numbers. 11 killed in an airstrike here, 40 there. And then there is the overall count of Palestinians that have been killed. The media makes sure that we have an updated number seemingly every hour. It seems as if the media thinks that as a Jew, I like hearing that terrible number. I don't. And furthermore, I don't know of any Jewish person who is happy about the number of lives lost in Gaza. But I have to ask, since when do we trust Hamas to keep and report an accurate number? Perhaps the UN is like me and they're bad at counting, because between May 6th and May 8th, their reports decreased the total number of women and children killed during the war by almost 47%. So whose count is accurate? Who can be trusted to keep the numbers correctly? It's harder than it looks, apparently. I struggle with the notion of counting people because I believe that every human being is worth something and nobody is just a number. But I also realize that if you don't have a correct count, tragedy can strike. I mean, that one kid almost jumped off of the balcony. So what do we do with all this? Well, I'll share with you something that I learned while researching all of this counting business. I didn't know this. The rabbis say that counting is so difficult, but yet so important, that there is a special bracha, a special blessing that one is supposed to say when you enter your barn to count grain. And with Shavuot next week, I thought this was particularly relevant. The rabbis say you're supposed to recite, quote, "May it be your will, O Lord our God, that you may send a blessing upon the work of our yadayim, upon the work of our hands." Now, I don't think too many of us nowadays own large barns of grain which require counting. So really what I think this is trying to tell us now is that we're supposed to ask God to help us, but not just in counting. In everything our yadayim do, everything our hands do, we need God's help. When we go to work, we need God's help. When we work on ourselves, we need God's help. When we raise our children, we certainly need God's help. And even when our IDF soldiers are fighting the enemy or defending our holy land, they need God's help. Fighting is hard. Counting terrible numbers can be hard. Hearing terrible numbers can be hard. And we can't do it alone. We need help from the divine. Ever since Passover concluded, each night we count the Omer, which will conclude next week. And I wish there was a final countdown to when this terrible war will end. That would be an Omer I would love to count. But until then, we have to put our trust in God and hope that all of those numbers from this terrible, egregious, heinous war stay low. So in conclusion, I hope that you have an easier time counting than me. And if you ever get caught doing something you weren't supposed to be doing, just remember the phrase, I was going to study Torah. Shabbat Shalom.